Good evening. Good evening, both of you. Good evening. Good evening, and a very warm welcome to the season finale of this brick session on the state we're in. I don't think anybody, do any of you not know who Neil is? Some woman over there doesn't know who you are, Neil. In trouble now. So, Neil has the unenviable task in this season finale of pulling together all the plot threads that we've had so far and making it into a satisfying conclusion to the course. But if anybody can do that, Neil can do it. So can I just pray for you? Lord, I just pray for Neil. Lord, we thank you for the gifts that you've given him, and we pray that this evening you will speak to us through the insight and wisdom he brings to us on this subject. Amen.
Thanks, John. Evening, everybody. So far, in our previous thrilling instalments, John has taken us through how the church is positioned with respect to the state. And then last week, the lovely Karen Shaw talked about the different formats that the church has adopted in recent times to deliver its mission to people who wouldn't otherwise engage with it. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is going to kind of bring those together in a sort of contrived kind of way. Talking about how the church has worked alongside the state over the past 2,000 years or so to deliver social and welfare support to the societies in which it finds itself. And the questions that we're going to ask at the end are, is this actually an essential part of the church's mission? And if it is, to what extent is that responsibility direct, i.e. for the whole church to deliver, or is it indirect for individual church communities and inspired individuals to pursue, with the church working in support of them? And you'll notice that I say we when we talk about answering these questions, because it's going to be down to you to answer them. Is that all right? Good, because I haven't prepared anything else. Okay, well, let's start just by going back in time a little bit to January 2021, when COVID-19 had been a fact of life for almost a year. There was a new variant sweeping the country, and a vaccine had yet to be approved at that stage for rollout. And for much of the previous 9 months, we'd all been in various degrees of lockdown, hadn't we, which had disrupted not only our lives, but the lives of the nation on an unimaginable scale. And one of the principal impacts of that was on people's livelihoods, because employees were placed on furlough, and despite the government's best efforts to compensate, some businesses became inoperable, and life became really hard for individuals and for families. And at the time, there was a group of us at St. Mark's who started to discuss the help and support that we as a church might be able to offer. Because at the time, we had a modest hardship fund in place, maybe a couple of £1,000. And this had traditionally been used on an ad hoc basis to help out the odd family here and there who had particular financial needs. And a dialogue developed about how we might best use this fund if there were now more families with more acute needs off the back of COVID, and whether it would be enough if the demand started to climb. And this then developed into a broader conversation about how far our responsibility as a church extended to support those families, and what kind of help we might be reasonably be expected to provide. And as we were thinking about this, there was a very timely article published in the Guardian newspaper by a Church of England clergyman called Fergus Butler Galley, who's now the vicar of St. Mary's in Charlbury near Oxford. And he's written a number of books, and he's a regular contributor to newspapers and to different periodicals, including the Church Times. And his article provided us with an amount of food for thought. As you can see, it was entitled, "The Conservative Party Thinks the Church of England Can Fill All Welfare Gaps. We can't." And it's still available online if you're interested. It's well worth digging out and having a read through. But its theme was something like this: Over the last 80 years or so, since the introduction of the welfare state in the 1940s, a particular synergistic relationship has developed between the church and government, and predominantly conservative governments, although we're not going to get involved in the politics of this tonight for obvious reasons. And in more recent times, this relationship has increasingly seen the government resile to a position in which it funds and provides a basic level of welfare across the country. And where that level proves insufficient, there's a presumption that other charitable institutions will step in to make up the shortfall. Other institutions which include the Church of England. And Butler Galley's observation was that the Church of England is uniquely bound into this presumption by its position as the established church, the official provider of state religion, if you like. And while other faith groups and secular charities can choose to step in to provide frontline services when the need is obvious, the Church of England is actually obliged to do so because of its connection with the state. And what this creates is a direct and extrinsic motivation to interact with what the government does, almost regardless of what the church's intrinsic motivation might be. And the article went on to highlight a number of the initiatives that individual churches have resourced in recent times to fill these gaps that are left by government. Things like lunch and breakfast clubs, food bank collection and distribution, grants of cash to cover heating and electricity bills, social spaces for pensioners, lonely people, asylum seekers, refugees, reading clubs, volunteers going into schools to plug gaps in defunded literacy programs, and so on and so forth. And Butler Galley suggested that many of these are things which might reasonably be considered to be the government's responsibility, part of the base level of welfare that government should provide. But the more that the church and other organisations step into this gap left by government and deliver these initiatives, the more it becomes assumed that it's actually part of their core responsibilities to do so. And this in turn allows government to consolidate its position, the position that it's resiled into. And in fact, it confirms the assumption on which the position is based. And that leaves the church to fund and deliver these initiatives in perpetuity. And the objection to that was twofold. First, that the introduction of the welfare state in the 1940s was the cue for the church to dispense with the infrastructure and the buildings that were previously in place to deliver services of this kind, because they were no longer needed. And so the modern church no longer has the capability to step fully into that gap without investing significantly to rebuild itself. And the second objection was that the will is no longer there. The church has its own issues to deal with, things like declining congregations, difficulty in recruiting clergy, crumbling buildings, internal divisions, so on and so forth. So even if the infrastructure and the capability were there, the willpower and the energy is much reduced. And so this assumed contract between the government and the church becomes unsustainable. It's a fairly pessimistic picture, isn't it? Although I think to some extent it probably reflects the spirit of the times when we were all a bit weary after 9 or 10 months of living under COVID. But what it did provide was an immediate and useful context for the discussion we were having at St. Mark's about what we could and couldn't be expected to provide in terms of community support. But it also highlighted that within that discussion, there were a number of different strands that we needed to try and unravel to make sense of it all. And that's what we're going to try and do tonight over the next sort of half hour or so, just pick some of those strands apart and see where they fall. I mean, in the first instance, there is the primary question, I suppose, of whether the church has any responsibility to cater for the welfare needs of the society in which it finds itself, which is predominantly a moral, a spiritual question. And so the answer to it is most likely to be found in the church's user manual, which is the Bible. And you don't have to look too far, I don't think, in the Bible to find some answers to this. I mean, certainly in the Old Testament laws given to Moses and written into the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which quite often get quite a bad rap, but do include these kind of demands of the Israelites, that they take care of the poor and the needy and the disadvantaged, especially the widows, orphans, and those from other tribes and nations who fall in with them as effectively refugees or asylum seekers. And Leviticus and Deuteronomy go on from there, and there's a whole load of other measures that are aimed at creating a fair and just society. Laws that require care for the land, provision for refugees, the good treatment of servants and workers, the outlawing of usury, so on and so forth. So all these things were part of the law that the Jewish people were required to observe up to and including Jesus' time. And as for Jesus himself, I don't think you need to look too far through the New Testament, do you, to find that his teaching aligned with this imperative to safeguard the welfare of the most needy in society. To give just a few examples, at the very beginning of his ministry in Luke 4, verses 18 to 19, Jesus sets out his manifesto that he's come to bring good news to the poor, proclaim freedom to the prisoners, give sight to the blind, and release the oppressed. And then in Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, he says that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who feed the hungry, welcome strangers, clothe the naked, tend to the sick, and visit those in prison. And in Matthew 19, verse 21, he tells the rich young ruler that the way for him to gain entry into the kingdom of heaven is to sell all his possessions and give it all to the poor. And consistently throughout Jesus' ministry, we see him championing the lost and the lowly, don't we? And challenging the inequality between the clean and the unclean, the rich and the poor, the worthy and the unworthy. And he's constantly engaged with all of those on the margins of society. He makes a point of getting close to those who are considered unclean to heal and comfort them. Lepers, the demon-possessed, prostitutes, adulterers, tax collectors, to the extent that he outrages the sensitivity of the religious leaders of the day. And in doing so, he exemplifies the teaching that he gives his disciples, which is that, second only to the commandment to love their God, they must love and serve each other. They must love and serve everyone, without exception or exclusion, in the same way that Jesus has loved and served them. And so when Jesus issues the Great Commission to go and make disciples of all nations and to teach them to obey everything he has commanded, what has he commanded? Well, both his ministry and his example have demonstrated the breadth of what this involves. It's not just preaching the gospel, it's also living out gospel values, showing the same care for the least and the lost that Jesus himself did. And if we then move on from there to what the Bible tells us about the life of the early church, we can see how this gets played out. On the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, we're told that there were Jews from all around the world in Jerusalem who'd come to celebrate the festival. And the Holy Spirit descends. Peter explains what this means and who Jesus was. And it says that around 3,000 people accept the truth of what they're told. And what's implicit, I think, in what happens next is that many of these people then abandon their homes and possessions back in their native lands, Persians and Medes from the east, people from the territories we now know as Turkey, Africans from Egypt and Libya, Greeks, Romans and Arabs. They don't seem to go home. They seem to decide to stay and live in Jerusalem in order to be part of this new Christian movement. And even if not all 3,000 of them stay, what this creates is a welfare challenge. Because you've got up to 3,000 people with only enough kit to get themselves through a short stay in Jerusalem, who are now landed permanently on the doorstep of the early church. And what happens is that the church rises to that challenge. Acts chapter 2, verses 44 to 47, and chapter 4, verses 32 to 35 tell us that those who had possessions sold them and donated the proceeds, and that everything that they had, they held in common. And they shared meals, they looked after each other. And according to Acts 4:34, the result of that was that there were no needy people among them. Now, Acts chapter 6 then tells us that one of the features of this was a daily distribution of food, especially to those who are the most vulnerable, the widows in the church. And in time, the logistics of this become a bit stretched, and some people start to miss out, and there's a bit of grumbling breaks out. And what happens next is commonly misinterpreted, and I apologise if you've heard me say this before at a 6:30 service, but I'm going to say it again because I like saying it. We're told that Stephen is one of 7 men who are chosen to deal with the situation. And the NIV tells us that the duty assigned to these men, Stephen and his colleagues, is to wait on tables, which you might assume to be the hands-on duty, the menial work of handing food out, wiping the tables afterwards, to liberate the apostles to concentrate on the important work of preaching the gospel. But I actually think there's a mistranslation at the heart of this. What these 7 men are to attend to is in Greek a trapeza. And yes, it does mean a dining table, but in the Greek world, it also has a range of other different and specific meanings which reflect the different uses that tables can be put to. And one of these reflects the fact that money changers and moneylenders use tables as the basis of their business. And so nowadays, when you walk through Greek towns and cities, you'll see this word trapeza used in signs overhanging particular buildings, because it's the modern day word that's commonly used for a bank. And so what's probably happening, I think, in Act 6 isn't that these 7 men are waiting on and wiping clean tables. It's that they set up one of the world's first ethical banks to manage all this money that has been raised by the early church in Jerusalem. And the need for this very practical provision continues to grow in subsequent chapters in Acts. We know not only from Acts 11, but also from a range of other ancient historical sources that there's a great famine in Judea during the reign of the Emperor Claudius. And we also know, both from Acts and from Paul's letters, that the church is newly founded across the Mediterranean world in Antioch, Corinth, Philippi and Thessalonica, collected money to send to Jerusalem to provide relief from that famine. And although the book of Acts doesn't tell us in as many words, that money had to go somewhere. And we can safely assume, I think, that it was probably deposited in the bank that Stephen and his colleagues had established and was used for the continuation of that social and welfare mission. So I think from those 3 chunks, if you like, Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Acts and the early church, we can say with some certainty that there's a sound biblical basis for saying that the church does have a responsibility to cater for the welfare and social needs of the communities in which it's located. And in the rest of this talk, we're going to look at some of the ways in which this responsibility has been delivered across the history of the church, and how it's interacted with what the state has been doing in the same areas. And as a health warning, I should say up front that this is going to be a terrible piece of history. I'm going to whiz across 2,000 years in a necessarily selective way, because basically we just don't have time tonight to go systematically through every initiative that the church has developed and delivered across that time frame and how they've all played out. And so we'll move fairly quickly and pick out just a few examples by way of illustration. And so I ask your forgiveness in advance for any sins of omission or conflation in what follows. And first is an example of how the church develops after the end of the book of Acts and across the first 2 or 3 centuries of its existence. Let's look at one of the several cities called Caesarea in the ancient world, this one in the middle of modern-day Turkey. And the church there was one of the big ones at the time. It was established by one of the disciples and led by several of the major figures in early church history. And one of these was this chap, Basil the Great, who served as Bishop of Caesarea from the year 370 onwards and was influential as an individual in a number of the major developments of the time, including the finalisation of the Nicene Creed in 381. But as well as being a grand theologian, Basil was also a monk, who'd spent his formative years in the monasteries around Asia Minor before taking up his role as a bishop. And he was so impressed by the work that he'd seen the monasteries do with the marginalised and the disadvantaged that he positioned that right at the heart of his ministry. And the big sign of this, perhaps the most notable of his achievements, was the building of a huge multifunctional institution that I'm going to try and pronounce now, which is a long, complicated Greek word, tokoptopheion, which was in the suburbs of Caesarea, and it was the first building of its kind, and its name basically means it's the place where the poor are seen. And so what it was a centre where Basil arranged for the poor to receive food and handouts, the unskilled to be trained in a trade so that they could earn a living, travellers to find shelter, the sick to receive medical treatment, the elderly to be cared for, and hospice care to be afforded to the dying. And one of his priorities was to raise funds for this. And he did that by telling the rich within his diocese that the only proper use of their wealth was to give it up in support of this kind of work. And this comes through in one of his more famous quotes, which is a direct echo of the parable of the sheep and goats. He says this: "The bread you store belongs to the hungry. The clothes you accumulate belong to the naked. The shoes that you have in your closet are for the barefoot. The money you bury deep in the ground to keep it safe belongs to the poor. You were unfair to as many people as you could have helped, and you did not." And Basil is still commemorated in Greece on St. Basil's Day. There's a huge party on the 1st of January when sweet bread is cooked and served with a coin inside, as you can see on the slide there. And what that does is call to mind his habit of giving money to the poor, but in such a way as to preserve their dignity by concealing the gift inside their daily distribution of bread. And that sort of long history, that long reputation, sees Basil recognised still as one of the fathers of Eastern monasticism. But he also gets credit for influencing the development of Western monasticism as well, not least because St. Benedict was hugely enthusiastic for his teaching and example and imported it across Europe and into this country. And so Basil's emphasis on personal discipline, prayer, study and observance, alongside care for those who were disadvantaged in society, subsequently became the operating model for the different monastic communities which established them across the Christian world, including in the UK. And in particular, these monasteries fulfilled an important role as providers of healthcare. Pretty much every monastery had an infirmary, if not two, one for the monks and one for those outside the order. And these became centres in which treatment was dispensed to the sick and empirical knowledge developed around the art and science of medicine. And one estimate is that there were around 1,200 institutions in the UK in the Middle Ages who could describe themselves as hospitals, all of which had some kind of association with monks and nuns. And many combined their care for the sick with a broader brief to provide hospitality to the poor, the elderly, and to pilgrim travellers, as Basil did in Caesarea. But there were some communities who were dedicated to treating specific diseases, such as leprosy. And as an example of this, let's pick out one particular Augustinian monk called Rahir, who lived in 12th century London, where he worked as a canon at St. Paul's Cathedral. And the tradition is that he visited Rome on pilgrimage and fell ill, and during a fever he saw a vision of a saint who instructed him to return to London and found a hospital. And so when he was recovered, he headed back to London and had himself installed as the leader of a church in Smithfield, where he duly set up a religious foundation for the treatment of the sick. And both the church and the hospital were named after the saint who appeared to him in the vision, who was St. Bartholomew. And the foundation has remained on the same site ever since, and is probably better known to you today as one of London's great teaching hospitals, which is Bart's. But this tradition of monks providing social and welfare support and healthcare came to a screeching halt in the 16th century with Henry VIII and his dissolution of the monasteries. Henry allowed a small number of hospitals in London to continue with their work, including Bart's, and an institution that was established by Augustinians in Southwark in the name of St. Thomas à Becket, which is also still in operation today, St. Thomas's, Tommy's. But much of the rest of the monastery's work fell into abeyance. And what this created was a variety of undesirable consequences, not least for the poor of the land, who'd previously relied on the monasteries for sustenance and were now bereft of any kind of support and so flooded into the cities to beg for money. And it's probably at this point that we start to see this uneasy collaboration between church and state for the delivery of welfare beginning to emerge. Because on the one hand, the state was quite happy to play bad cop, to address the crowds of beggars and appearing on the streets through rounding them up, branding them, imprisoning them, and even hanging them as a discouragement to others. But on the other, it took to pressuring the church to play good cop, to raise money for handouts. For example, in 1547, when there was a decree passed that voluntary Sunday collections in churches should be replaced with a mandatory collection for the poor. And this carrot and stick approach in time became codified into a series of poor laws, which developed from the Tudor period onwards. And the notable thing about these is that they used the parishes of the newly Protestant Church of England as the basic units of an administrative, a delivery network, which restated the church's position on the front line of welfare provision. And there were around 15,000 parishes across England and Wales, and each of these was afforded responsibility, first for maintaining a register of the poor within their boundaries, and then to cater for their needs. And this register discriminated between two main categories of the poor: those who were able to work but couldn't, either through circumstance, their age or infirmity. These were the deserving poor. And for these people, the church was part of a system of welfare support, which included a distribution of money, food and clothes, a dole, for those who lived in their own homes, and the creation of orphanages, almshouses and poorhouses to support those without a home. And on the other side, those who were able to work but wouldn't, they were considered the undeserving poor, and they remained at the mercy of the state, who continued to publicly shame them with the aim of motivating them to do better. And funds for the dole were raised through a compulsory land tax, which was administered by local officials. And these often included the local minister and the church wardens. But over time, this system began to move away from one which had the church at its heart. In a drive for efficiency, parishes came together to form joint ventures which worked across parish boundaries. There were local corporations who evolved out of this, which ran workhouses on more commercial lines. And this created greater separation between the provision of work for the poor and care for the old and infirm. And these developments then became formalised in the new Poor Law of 1834, which instituted workhouses across the country on an industrial scale. And life within these was supposed to be as unpleasant as possible, again, in order to create a disincentive. And in response to that, the role of the church began to evolve again, away from being an integral part of a system which fulfilled biblical principles of concern for the poor, and towards a position of dissent. Because this new poor law saw families separated. It saw those in workhouses dressed in uniforms like prisoners. It saw rations and living conditions made ever more Spartan, all to provide a deterrent to poverty. And so the church positioned itself in opposition to these developments, lobbying against the law and demanding regular access to the different institutions, so that it could play the role of safeguarding the welfare of individuals, of workers, in the way that Jesus demanded. And one of the ways in which the church turned to promote this welfare was to address the education of the most disadvantaged. Now, religious education had been embedded in the organisation of the Christian faith since the very beginning. As far back as Acts 2, we find the early church devoted to the apostles' teaching. And it's self-evident, I think, that the development of the different Christian communities and monasteries around the Mediterranean over the subsequent few hundred years had the study of theology at its heart. And in this country, the very first educational institutions were religious foundations, set up by St. Augustine in the late 6th and early 7th century in Kent, with the specific purpose of providing priests and choristers for the church. And this was the model that then developed over the next 200 years, while the first universities established in Oxford and Cambridge in the 12th century also had the same express purpose of training the clergy. And this founding principle of religious education was an abiding one. As late as the 19th century, all university fellows and many schoolmasters were either expected or required to be in holy orders. But needless to say, these institutions catered exclusively for sons of the gentry. There was no systematic education of girls, while the education of the poor was actually outlawed by Richard II in 1391, as the economy depended on them working the land and not seeking ideas above their station. And while the number of schools grew between the 14th and 17th century to around 2,000, offering paid education to those who could afford it and scholarships to those who couldn't, there were still nowhere near enough places to cater for all of the school-age population. And the workhouses that we talked about a moment or so ago were meant to provide a basic apprenticeship and some literacy and numeracy to the children in their care, but in reality, this was sporadic at best. But this allowed the church then to return to the front line in the 18th century with the start of the Sunday school movement. Now, this is popularly attributed to an Anglican layman and newspaper publisher called Robert Raikes in Gloucester in 1780, although there's also evidence for a Sunday school some 30 years earlier in Nottingham. But both of these were a response to the observation that the poor children in the workhouses were fully engaged for 6 days of the week, but then left to their own devices on a Sunday, when, in Raikes's words, and I quote, "The street is filled with the multitudes of these wretches who, released on that day from employment, spend their time in noise and riot, playing at chuck and cursing and swearing in a manner so horrid as to convey to any serious mind an idea of hell." And so Raikes moved forward with a threefold intention: to civilize these children who were running riot, to teach them to read, and to instruct them in the catechism. And he found a number of women in his parish who were both able and willing to serve as teachers, and paid them £1 a day for their services. And in the first instance, there was a fair bit of opposition. There was complaints both that it desecrated the Sabbath and that it was prone to politicization. But once established as an idea, it spread like wildfire. Within 10 years, there were 300,000 children attending local Sunday schools, and within 50 years, there were 1.25 million, which was around 25% of the population. And what that did was help the idea of universal education for school-aged children gather pace. In 1811, the snappily titled National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor in the Principles of the Established Church in England and Wales was established. And fortunately, that title gets shortened fairly quickly to the National Society. And this was the work of another Anglican layman, a chap called Joshua Watson, and a clergyman called Henry Handley Norris, who set out with the ambition to set up a school in every parish in England and Wales, again using that basic unit of the church as a framework for delivery. And here the stated aim was that the national religion should be made the foundation of national education and should be the first and chief thing taught to the poor, according to the excellent liturgy and catechism provided by our church. And Watson and Norris led a major fundraising campaign, and clergy and parishes were then encouraged to apply for grants to set up schools. And within 2 years, there were 30 schools, but by 1824, there were 100 times that number. There were 3,000 schools with 400,000 children in attendance. albeit in most cases this was still just for one day a week on a Sunday. But what the success of the National Society did was prompt action in others. The Secular British and Foreign Schools Society was set up around the same time to establish schools on a similar but non-religious basis, while government then felt compelled to respond in the 1830s through a series of laws which supported the construction of schools for poor children. And by the time of the census of 1851, the National Society had sponsored as many as 12,000 schools. And if you think of that figure of 15,000 parishes, it's more or less one in every parish, isn't it, or not far off. And what that did was lay the platform then for the introduction of the Elementary Education Act in 1870, which signalled the government's acceptance of this drive that the church had led, and was the first time that education was declared mandatory for boys and girls between the ages of 5 and 13, to be delivered through a combination of church schools, private schools, and new board schools, which were established by the state. And by the time of the Balfour Act in 1902, which established local education authorities for the first time, the church found itself responsible for the education of a third of all elementary-aged children. And now, in 2025, a quarter of all primary schools and 228 secondary schools are Church of England foundations. There's 1,540 Church of England academies and 280 multi-academy trusts which hold Church of England articles. And approximately 1 million children at present are in attendance at a Church of England school, while the Church of England website tells us that around 15 million adults alive today are graduates of one of those schools. And that's clearly not counting the schools that were founded by other denominations. There's over 2,000 Catholic schools in England and Wales, for example, not to mention the Methodists and others. And that Balfour Act in 1902 heralded the beginning of a century when the state stepped more definitively and decisively into areas where we've seen that the church previously led the way. Not just education, but healthcare and welfare as well. And this all came to a head, culminated in the Beveridge Report, published in 1942, which identified 5 pressing issues that the state needed to address once the Second World War had ended: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. And the Labour government elected in 1945 more or less adopted this report in full. And within 5 years, they'd enacted a series of reforms that introduced the foundations of the modern welfare state: national insurance, family allowance, the basic state pension, and of course the National Health Service, each of which remains in place today. And it's commonly recognised that the author of the 1942 report, William Beveridge, was influenced by his great friend William Temple, who was by then the Archbishop of Canterbury. As Temple had been advocating for the state to take the lead in welfare, healthcare and education for much of the previous 30 years, including in 1915, where he gave a flagship series of lectures entitled Church and Nation. And these included this rather striking statement: the first task of the church is to inspire the state, which after all very largely consists of the same persons as itself, with the desire to combat evil. And the second is to counteract the one great difficulty which the state experiences, which is officialism. What is officialism? Simply a lack of love. And this statement isn't only pertinent to the issues we're discussing tonight, but it also happens to be quoted in the newspaper article by Fergus Butler-Galley, with which we began this Cook's tour. And so we've now come full circle. So let's pause and draw breath and assess the progress that we've made in answering the exam question which we set ourselves at the start, which, to remind you, was this: is it an essential part of the church's mission to deliver social and welfare support to those in need? And if it is, to what extent? So we've looked at the biblical position, And we've concluded that both the Old and New Testaments place a strong imperative on serving the needy and disadvantaged within society. We've looked at how the church has responded to this over the years. The early church in the book of Acts, establishing a system of giving and banking to support the poor and the hungry. We've seen the monastic communities taking it on themselves to care for the destitute and provide hospital services for the sick. And then we've seen different initiatives taken by the church at different times in history to deliver handouts and housing for the poor and to educate those who are excluded. And we've also seen how the relationship between church and state has fluctuated from time to time. How sometimes the state has been absent and the church has carried the burden on its own. And at other times the state has taken the lead and demanded that the church does its bidding. And at other times we've seen the church shame and lobby and influence the state into doing the right thing, sometimes by enacting innovations and initiatives, and sometimes just through words. As I say, it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, hasn't it? And one that I would fully acknowledge has been fairly broad brush, selective and eclectic. And we haven't even touched on any of the great charitable and social movements led by individual Christians on their own account, outside of the church's purview. As on any other day, we might have talked at length about William and Catherine Booth and the Salvation Army, or Chadvara and the Samaritans, or Paddy and Carol Henderson and the Trussell Trust and their chain of food banks, or John Kirby and Christians Against Poverty, or Steve Chalk and the Oasis Trust and their work to end disadvantage through education and housing and health and family support, or all of the many other brilliant things that Christians are doing to deliver Jesus' mission globally, nationally, and in their own communities. But these people and these fantastic initiatives, I think, raise a parallel question, which is the extent to which they could be said to have acted on behalf of the church, as individual Christians representing the body of the church. And also what the church would say about itself and its own role in respect of those kind of initiatives. If you go on the Church of England website, you'll find this page, which is probably a bit small for you to read, but it's a page relating to poverty, welfare and inclusion. And in it you find words like the church will highlight, challenge, encourage and support, work in partnership with, research, lead by example. And if you go further down, it goes on to talk about joining campaigns, but also you'll find links to funding programs like the Church and Community Fund and the Church Urban Fund, whose aims are to support and further the initiatives of others to address the kinds of social issues that we're talking about tonight. And what you don't see is the church positioning itself as a frontline deliverer anymore of social action, healthcare, welfare support and education. What you see is it portraying itself as a supporter and a facilitator of those who do, whether that's individual church communities responding to the needs of their particular parish, or driven individuals who have a calling to fulfill, like the Hendersons, John Kirby, Steve Chalk, and Robert Rakes and Joshua Watson before them. And what this statement seems to say is that the church as an institution stands behind and encourages these people when they arise, and will provide moral and financial support when appropriate. But what it won't do is commit itself to wholesale action across all of its outlets. Do you think that's a fair and reasonable interpretation of the church that you are a member of? Well, let's go back to those questions that we said at the beginning of this talk that we'd ask ourselves at the end, which were these. Is social action, healthcare, welfare support and education the responsibility of the modern day church? And if it is that responsibility universal across all manifestations of the church? Or is it more individual and contextual, based on the local circumstances of the church and all the enthusiasms, callings and capabilities of the people involved in it? Now, usually at this stage of a Brick Talk, I would take questions for the speaker, but tonight these questions are from the speaker to you, the audience. So I think John has a roving mic. We'll move now to addressing these questions. Hopefully what we've talked about for the last 45 minutes or so has given you some food for thought, maybe told you a couple of things you didn't know, alongside probably plenty that you already did. So what do you think? How would you answer these questions? Over to you.